Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Do you have a headset if you need it? I'm very honored to be with you. Thank you to Maria Magroni, my friend. Thanks to UNTREF and the American Embassy for bringing me. It's a thrill for me to be in Argentina, one of the true countries of poetry. When I was a young poet, I was so committed to metaphor that I felt that I should have belonged to the movement ultraismo, and that I should have been late invited to join the group from Florida. So now I'm ready to report, but I'm 90 years too late. Nonetheless, I'm here. I want to talk to you about the experience of reading poetry and how I understand it and what it means to me. I'm particularly going to speak about lyric poetry, the short poem that's been practiced for 4,500 years. There's never been a culture without it. It precedes prose in all languages, all civilizations. I consider it a human fundamental like music. It has its roots in the Egyptian hieroglyph and the Chinese ideogram, the Hebrew letter, the Greek alphabet. The Greeks defined the lyric as a poem to be chanted or sung to the accompaniment of a lyre. That's how it got its name. It emerged from religious ritual, tribal practice. What I'm going to talk to you about today is the written lyric. The written lyric was always counterposed against the epic. The epic, you know, you have one, Argentina got its name from the epic La Argentina. The epic is the story of a tribe. It tells the tale of a tribe. The singer of the tale tells the story of a people. It's a collective experience. It's always nostalgic, how people came to be formed, how the tribe came to be formed, how it got here. Against that collective experience, which we know, for example, from the Homeric epics, the lyric is the voice of an individual, the solitary. So when you think of the epic, you think of, say, Homer. When you think of the lyric, you think of Sappho as the origin. And so when Sappho writes her poem, Thanatoi Moi, I hope you know this lyric, where she's sitting in a cafe and she sees her lover sitting with another person, a man, and she's torn with jealousy, overwhelmed with jealousy, and she begins to have a kind of meltdown. It's a kind of lyric meltdown. This poem, which is written, opens the space for personal feeling, which the epic does not give you. There's no room in the epic for the personal experience because it's the larger tale of the group. But the lyric opens the space for this individual feeling. I call it unauthorized testimony. And what I mean by that is that it's not authorized because it does not come with the backing of a religion or a creed. It's the testimony of an individual. Sappho's not relying on a religion to explain what she's feeling, which we also feel when we read her poem. She gives it to herself. This is what distinguishes, this unauthorized testimony is what distinguishes poetry from religion, because it has many of the same roots. The question is, how do we think about this experience of the lyric poem? When I don't know if you had this in Argentina, when I was a young poet, my teachers were part of something that was called new criticism. The new criticism was a form of reading poetry that made reading poetry scientific. And the idea was that you studied poetry for its ambiguities, its paradoxes, its difficulties. And the task of the poet, the task of the reader, was to find out what those difficulties were. And you apprenticed yourself to those difficulties. Now, I'm very grateful to my teachers for teaching me how to read poetry. But I always felt that there was something wrong with this understanding of poetry. But it took me a long time to figure out what I thought that was. And the thing that's left out of that idea of poetry is the reader. That way of reading poetry makes the whole meaning of poetry exist in the book itself, in the poem. But I don't believe that's true. I believe the meaning of the poem exists in the relationship that's established between the reader and the poem and the poet. That the poem doesn't have any meaning on its own. The poem has meaning when the reader reads it. That experience of contact is what gives the poem meaning. Of course, you can figure out the words, but for the words to have any kind of feeling, for them to mean something, then you have to have a reader. Robert Graves calls poetry a form of stored magic. He means that literally. And what he means by that is the magic is in the bottle. The magic is in a poem, but it just stays there until someone reads it. And when someone reads it, then the magic is released into the reader. I believe that all those books in the library, they don't exist fully. They only exist fully when someone takes them down and reads them. Because the contact is what gives it meaning. When you read a poem, your voice, your body, your vocal cords become the body of the experience. It's not the poet's body any longer. It's the reader's body that gives voice to this poem. Now, it can be a form of ventriloquism. You can feel as if you're channeling the poet, but nonetheless, it's your body, your vocal cords that give meaning to this experience. That's not true when you're looking at a painting. You're not making the painting, but in some way you are making the poem. So I believe that this establishes a relationship between the reader and the poem, and that's what's the premise of my whole talk. And I basically ransacked the history of literature to try to prove to you that I'm right, that reading is relationship. And with this idea, I found a quote from the great Holocaust poet, Paul Celan, who grew up in a part of Romania that was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was, his parents were arrested and taken to a concentration camp, and he escaped and survived, later moved to Paris and committed suicide. He's one of the most difficult 20th century poets. But even Paul Celan, the most difficult poet, says, a poem, as a manifestation of language, and thus essentially dialogue, can be a message in a bottle, sent out in the not always greatly hopeful belief that somewhere and sometime it would wash up on land, on Heartland perhaps. So Celan is, I said you would come, thank you. Celan's idea is a poem is a message in a bottle. That the poet writes a poem, puts the message in the bottle, and sends it out. And someone reads it. Now, Celan, it turns out, is picking up on something that he read from one of his heroes, the great Russian poet Osip Mandelstam. And in 1916, Mandelstam wrote a little essay called On the Addressee. Are you with me here? Can you follow what I'm... Okay. So in 1916, Mandelstam wrote this essay called On the Addressee. In it he says, at a critical moment, a seafarer tosses a sealed bottle into the ocean waves, containing his name and a message detailing his fate. Wandering along the dunes, many years later, I happen upon it in the sand. I read the message, note the date, the last will and testament of one who has passed on. I have the right to do so. I have not opened someone else's mail. The message in the bottle was addressed to its finder. I found it. That means I have become its secret addressee. This is a remarkable idea. The poem is a message in the bottle sent out to whoever finds it. Now, many years later, someone comes along, finds this unlikely looking bottle from the past, opens it, and begins to read it. The thing about this is you're not reading someone else's mail, which I think is a funny joke. It's addressed to whoever found it. I found it, therefore it's addressed to me. And I hope you've had the experience that I've had where you read certain poems and you say, this is a great poem. I can see it's great, but it doesn't speak to me. You read other poems and you go, this poem feels as if it was written just for me. You are the secret addressee of this text. And this text depends upon the mutuality of the writer and the reader. In his first book of poems, Fervor of Buenos Aires, Borges has a very funny apology to the reader, which is related to what I'm saying. He says, if in the following pages there is some successful verse or other, may the reader forgive me the audacity of having written it before him. We are all one. Our inconsequential minds are much alike, and circumstances so influence us that it is something of an accident that you are the reader and I the writer, the unsure, ardent writer of these verses. Now, that's funny and a bit ridiculous and weirdly true. I mean, it's weird to apologize to the reader and say, dear reader, I'm sorry I wrote these poems first. It's only an accident that I wrote them and you reading them. But there's also something true about it. And the thing that's true is sometimes you read a poem and so deeply does it speak to your inner life that you feel almost as if you are writing the thing to which you're actually only responding. So deeply does this experience answer the desire that it awakens. The first time I had this experience, I could not describe what happened to you, but I was 18 years old and I was a freshman in college and I didn't know anything about poetry. And I decided that every time someone mentioned the name of a poet, I would go and read that poet, which I highly recommend to you. If you do that for 50 years, you do learn something, which has been my method. So I was in the middle of I was in the Middle West in the United States, and I heard of a poet named Gerard Manley Hopkins. And I'd never heard of him before. Someone mentioned him in class. And I went to the library and I got out a book by Hopkins and I brought it back to my dorm room. And I began to read a poem, one of the so-called terrible sonnets. And it begins, I wake and feel the fell of dark, not day. What hours, oh, what black hours we have spent this night. What sights you, heart saw, ways you went, and more must with longer lights delay. With witness I speak this, but where I say hours, I mean years, mean life. And my lament is cries countless, cries like dead letters sent to dearest him who lives, alas, away. I am gall, I am heartburn. I wish I could explain to you what that did to me. Emily Dickinson says that when you read a great poem, you feel as if the top of your head were taken off. That's how I felt. I wake and feel the fell of dark, not day. He wakes up, it's still the middle of the night. What hours, oh, what black hours we have spent this night. What ways you, heart saw. He addresses his own heart. And more must, and yet longer lights delay. I'm not out of this yet. And then it's as if he raises his hand. With witness I speak this. But where I say hours mean years, he's allegorizing. Mean life. And my lament is cries countless. Cries like dead letters sent to dearest him who lives, alas, away. My cries are like letters that are sent to a dead post office. They're supposed to be addressed to God. But God doesn't seem to be listening. He seems to have moved away. And I'm alone. This poem I felt some recognition when I read this poem, some desolation that I'd felt in myself, but I could not name. And that Hopkins' poem, which is so terribly lonely, didn't make me feel more lonely. It made me feel less lonely. It made me feel companioned. Now, much later, years later, this became a kind of metaphor for reading poetry for me, because here was Gerard Manley Hopkins, an Anglican priest from Wales, who was posted in Ireland in his desolation in the 1870s. And here I am, a Jewish kid from Chicago, in the late 60s in his dorm room, and I read this poem, and it speaks more deeply to me than anything my friends have said to me, or any connection I have socially. And this becomes a kind of metaphor for me for the contact that can take place between two spirits. And what's more, I start looking at the poem, and I look down, I go, excuse me, holy shit. This thing is a sonnet. I mean, he's not just writing out his lines, he's actually made this into something that rhymes. He's made this into a structure. He didn't just write this down the way I'm writing down my poems. He's actually shaping it. And this began to feel to me like something terrifically noble and generous. Here's Gerard Manley Hopkins in his great desolation, not just writing to his diary, but taking the trouble to dramatize this experience, to shape it into something so that someone, years later, not a friend, a stranger, comes and reads it and feels what he felt. And what's more, it began to make me feel that poetry, no matter how desolate its subject matter, is not desolate. It's always hopeful, because the very premise of a poem suggests the possibility of a reader. Remember that Celan says, when he says the message in the bottle, sent out in not always greatly hopeful belief that somewhere it will arrive. You might not feel great hope because the people around you may not understand it all. But the idea of putting it into a bottle and shaping it into a form, putting it into a bottle and sending it out, suggests that there's a reader on the horizon. Maybe centuries away, maybe in a different country, maybe translated into a different language. Nonetheless, it suggests a reader. And this idea of the reader means that the idea of poetry is always a form of communication. The French poet Paul Valéry says, "I'm sorry to inform you, do not be shocked by this idea. The purpose of poetry is not to inspire the poet, it's to inspire the reader." The idea of making something. The oldest word for poetry in Greek is poiesis, which means making. A poet is a maker, and a poem is a made thing. The very premise of making suggests that making is being made for someone else. In his collected poems, Borges talks about the taste of the apple, states Barclay, lies in the contact of the fruit and the palate, not in the fruit itself. In a similar way, I would say, poetry lies in the meeting of the poem and the reader, not in the line of symbols printed on the pages of a book. What is essential is the aesthetic act, the thrill, the physical emotion that comes with each reading. So the symbols alone are not enough. The meaning relies in the contact and the relationship. That's why for the reading of poetry, instead of "in the beginning was the word," I prefer Martin Buber's idea, "in the beginning is the relation." The relation precedes the word because it's authored by the human. Now, I just want to say, I don't want you to be shocked later when you realize that I've just made the reading of poetry into a Jewish activity. I believe that poetry delivers on our spiritual lives precisely because it gives us this dual experience, privacy and participation, interiority and communication, in a way that no other form does because of the primacy of its feeling, its condensation, and the way that words are actualized to their highest power. Coleridge defines poetry as the best words in the best order. I don't think that's accurate. I think it's much more than that. I think it's a contact between souls. I think it's a contact between my interior life and your interior life, even though we are not physically present to each other. And that's why reading is different than the oral experience of poetry. That's why it's different when you say than when you go to a poetry reading. The nature of the written lyric is different than the nature of oral poetry. When people were listening to the Homeric epics, they were sitting in an audience in a tribe, one of the ancient sources of poetry, and a singer of tale begins singing and telling you a story. Now, when you're listening to that story, if you want to stop, you can't. You have to pay attention to the narrative thrust of the story. If you want to think about the famous Homeric simile, you don't have time, because you have to pay attention to the story, because you'll get completely lost if you stop. But when you are reading Sappho, and Sappho defines Eros and calls it Eros the bittersweet, and she takes the word bitter, and she takes the word sweet, and combines them for the first time, sweet bitter, and she calls love that, you can stop and think, what does that mean? Love is not just bitter. Love is not just sweet. We all recognize what that means now, but someone had to name it. When you're reading, you can stop. You can read all the way through. You can pause. You can go back. You can think about it. You can try to understand the metaphor. It doesn't just have to fly by you. And while you try to understand the metaphor, you participate in making its meaning. You are active. You are not the passive recipient. And the reason I'm so evangelical about this is because I believe that poetry depends upon its readers, that readers give poems the experience. And by the way, all great poets are great readers. Poets are not just people who respond to their own experience. Poets are people who've been so actualized, dramatized, revealed by what they've read that they want to respond in kind. People make much about the great American poet Emily Dickinson and her solitude. But when you read Dickinson's letters, it becomes very clear that she was companioned by poetry and that she saw herself with the poets and that she was in intimate contact and communication with what she calls her kinsmen of the shelf. She was befriended by poetry. This is a kind of experience that I believe you can't get elsewhere. The fact that there's never been a culture without poetry is not because they're just some bohemians like the people in this room who happen to like it. It's because poetry carries a certain kind of knowledge that you can't get elsewhere. It carries a certain kind of emotion and feeling, a certain way of thinking, an associative way of thinking that you can only get from poetry. Because poems can be difficult. But the fact that there's never been a culture without it suggests that there must be essential in this way of knowing. And I believe that the thing that's essential is this subjective way of experience. That we go through the world alone with others. The experience that we have with others is never exactly the same of what the experience is of all the others. But it's not entirely separate either. Language is by definition social. When I write a poem, no matter how alone I feel, and no matter how alone I am, when I use language, I participate in something that joins me to other people because language is social. Despair is a kind of inner muteness. But when I articulate something, and try to articulate it and try to shape it into a form, when the poet tries to make it into something that will live apart from the poet, that's an act of great hopefulness. And that hopefulness is a way of communicating something to other people about their own interior lives. This seems to me more important than ever now, where we are continually bombarded by 24-hour news cycles and by endless advertising. At least in the United States, there's no moment, there's no space where you can go where people are not trying to sell you something. It's so common that we're not even aware of it anymore. We're so used to being sold to, pitched to, that we just think this is the nature of life. You just go to Cuba and you're just stunned that there's no advertising. You go, whoa, that was my primary experience of Cuba. The Cubans were a little nonplussed by my sense that the main thing is that there's no advertising. But it's very striking. Advertising is a way to try and convince you and sell you of something and create something into in terms of material wants. Poetry gives you another kind of information. It awakens you to your own interior and spiritual life. And when we don't pay attention to poems, we don't pay attention to that part of ourselves, which is easy to leave off. Am I allowed to mention Pablo Neruda in Argentina? There's a wonderful essay by Neruda called Childhood in Poetry. And in this essay, he talks about being a child in Temuco, where he was from. And he goes into the backyard, and there's a hole in the backyard, in the fence. And he sees at some moment that a little hand comes in and puts a little broken toy sheep in the hole. And he takes it out, this sheep. He'd never seen a more wonderful toy in his life. And then he goes in the house and he takes out a treasured pine cone that he loves to look at. And he takes the pine cone and he puts it in the hole in the fence. And then a hand takes it and it disappears. Neruda says this is the origin of his poetry. I never saw the hand or the boy again. He says, to feel the love of people who we love is a fire that feeds our life. But to feel the affection that comes from those whom we do not know, those unknown to us, who are watching over our sleep and our solitude, over our dangers and our weaknesses, that is something still greater and more beautiful, because it widens out the boundaries of our being and unites all living things. That exchange brought home for me the first time a precious idea that all of humanity is together. It won't surprise you that I wanted to give something resiny, earth-like, and fragrant in exchange for human brotherhood. That is the great lesson I learned in my childhood, in the backyard of a lonely house. Maybe it was nothing but a game that two boys played who did not know each other and wanted to pass to the other some good things of life. Yet maybe the small and mysterious exchange of gifts remained inside me also, deep and indestructible, giving my poetry light. This is remarkable to me. It's at the heart of what I'm trying to say to you. Here are a group of words on the page. Here are some signs, some squiggly letters inscribed on a page. Mere air. And yet, there's something in these sounds, in these words, that is indestructible. Thank you. Maria Rilke sacrificed everything for his art. He dedicated himself to the great work. I admired his single-mindedness all through my 20s. I argued his case. Now I think he was a jerk for skipping his daughter's wedding for fear of losing his focus. He believed in the ancient enmity between daily life and the highest work, or Ruth and the Dueno elegies. It is probably a middle-class prejudice of mine to think that Anna Akhmatova should have raised her son Lev instead of dropping him on her husband's mom. Motherhood is a bright torture, she confessed. I was not worthy of it. Lev never considered it sufficient for her to stand outside his prison month after month, clutching packages and composing requiem for the masses. I argued with Rilke and Akhmatova all the years I shuttled Gabriel to school and then locked down with their poems. I argued with them while I scribbled away in the pizza joints and video arcades. It is a true error to marry with poets, John Berryman concluded, or to be by them.
Rainer Maria Rilke lo sacrificó todo por el arte. Se dedicó por entero a la obra maestra. Yo admiraba su empecinamiento cuando tenía 20 años. Argumenté a su favor. Ahora pienso que era un imbécil. Ahora pienso que fue un imbécil al no asistir a la boda de su hija por miedo a perder su centro. Rilke creía en la incompatibilidad entre la vida diaria y la obra mayor, o entre Ruth y las elegías de Duino. Quizás un prejuicio de clase media mío, pensar que Anna Akhmatova debió criar a su hijo Lev, en lugar de abandonarlo con la mamá de su esposo. La maternidad es una luminosa tortura, confesaba, yo no fui digna de ella. Lev nunca consideró suficiente que se pasara fuera de la cárcel mes tras mes, apretando paquetes y componiendo su requiem para las masas. Yo discutía con Rilke y con Akhmatova todos los años mientras llevaba a Gabriel a la escuela, y luego, metido en sus poemas, discutía con ellos mientras garabateaba en los puestos de pizza y en los centros de videos. Es un verdadero error casarse con poetas, dijo Berryman, o estar cerca de ellos.
Mr. Impulsive walked out of class when he did not like what the teacher said. It was boring. Mr. Impulsive scurried out in a storm wearing shorts and a wife beater. Soon he was shivering. The neighbors complained to the landlord, complained to me, but Mr. Impulsive could not be bothered to close the gate. Mr. Impulsive left the house without his keys. I don't know how many times he camped out on the front stoop. One night he convinced a neighbor to shimmy the lock with a credit card. He was never locked out again. Mr. Impulsive will not be sleeping at home. He'd rather stay out and crash wherever he finds himself at 5 a.m. He could be oddly well-mannered to the parents of his friends. He was usually welcome. From the notebook of Mr. Impulsive, it is better to sneak through a side door than to wait in line like a sucker. It is not necessary to get directions. It's much better to head out right now. Time doesn't matter. These were the antics of Mr. Impulsive, who never knew where he was going until he got there.
Mr. Impulsivo se salía del salón de clases cuando no le gustaba lo que decía el profesor. Era aburrido. Mr. Impulsivo salía desabrigado en medio de la tormenta, en shorts, camiseta sin mangas. En un ratito ya estaba tiritando. Los vecinos se quejaron con el dueño, se quejaron conmigo, pero a Mr. Impulsivo le daba igual cerrar la reja o no. Mr. Impulsivo salió de casa sin sus llaves, no sé qué cantidad de veces, Acampaba en el porche de la entrada. Una noche convenció a un vecino de forzar la puerta con una tarjeta de crédito. Nunca más volvió a quedarse a la intemperie. Mr. Impulsivo no se preocupaba por llegar a dormir. Mejor pasarla afuera hasta quedar frito en donde cayera a las 5 de la mañana. Podía ser extremadamente educado con los padres de sus amigos. Casi nunca fue mal recibido. Del cuaderno de notas de Mr. Impulsivo, siempre es mejor escabullirse por la puerta lateral que esperar en la fila como un tarado. No vale la pena saber la dirección, mejor salir ya de una vez, el tiempo no importa. Esas eran las gracias de Mr. Impulsivo, que nunca sabía a dónde iba hasta que ya estaba ahí.
From the storybook of bluster and bad judgment, from the annals of loneliness, from the history of kids he met on the street in special programs, it was dangerous to stay in Amherst. Lord of misadventure, I'm scared of rounding him up and turning him into a story. God of scribbles and erasures, I hope he shines through like a Giacometti portrait. I keep scraping the canvas and painting him over again, but he keeps slipping away. He was like a spider preyed on by other spiders and older insects. Sweet venom, his arrivals were sweet and his departures sudden. I couldn't understand how he lifted the shower door right off its hinges. When Gabriel cooked, the flames rose too high and the fire alarm sounded. When the fire alarm sounded, he tore it off the wall and left the wires dangling.
El libro ilustrado de las fanfarronerías y las decisiones equivocadas, de los anales de soledad, de las historias de muchachos que encontró en la calle en los programas especiales. Era peligroso quedarse en Amherst. Señor de las desventuras, temo retocarlo demasiado y convertirlo en un relato. Señor de los garabatos y las borraduras, espero que asome y brille como un retrato de Giacometti. Me la paso raspando la tela y pintándolo una y otra vez, pero siempre se me escabulle. Era como una araña perseguida por otras arañas e insectos más viejos. Dulce veneno, sus llegadas eran inesperadas, sus partidas súbitas. Yo no podía entender cómo fue capaz de arrancar la puerta de la ducha con todo y bisagras. Cuando Gabriel cocinaba, las llamas subían tan alto que sonaba la alarma. Cuando sonaba la alarma, la arrancaba de la pared y dejaba los cables colgando.
He liked to kick back and remember the time we were riding home in a taxi cab on the West Side Highway, and my mother offered to take him to a strip club for his 21st birthday. What's wrong with that, she wanted to know. Why they couldn't celebrate together. That's just what you want, he bellowed, going for a lamp dance with Grandma. He liked to kick back and declare he wanted to track down his birth mother to see if he really had Celtic blood. He liked to kick back and tell my family about the time he saw an American Hasidic Jewish reggae musician at Hampshire College. He saw Nicolas Cage going up in an escalator in a movie theater and turned to his friends. I hate Nicolas Cage. He has such a big head. He liked to kick back and tell us how much he liked weed and shrooms. How bad could it be for you, he said. It comes out of the ground. He liked to kick back and roll a spliff with his friends at night. He always liked to go higher and higher. We're here, he'd say, lifting his hand to the middle of his chest. But we need to go here, he continued on, and raised his hand up to his neck.
Le gustaba poltronarse y recordar la vez en que regresábamos a casa en un taxi por la autopista del West Side. Y mi madre le propuso llevarlo a un bar de striptease cuando cumplió 21 años. ¿Qué tiene de malo, quería saber ella? ¿Por qué no podían celebrarlo juntos? Eso es justo lo que se me antoja, bramó, que me bailen encima con mi abuela al lado. Le gustaba apoltronarse y anunciar que quería encontrar a su madre biológica para ver si era verdad que tenía sangre celta. Le gustaba apoltronarse y contarle a la familia de cuando vio a un músico de reggae en Hampshire College, judío hasídico estadounidense, de cuando vio a Nicolas Cage en la escalera eléctrica de un cine y volteó y les dijo a sus amigos: no soporto a Nicolas Cage, tiene una cabeza enorme. Le gustaba apoltronarse y contarnos cómo le gustaban el porro y los hongos. ¿En qué te puede hacer daño?, decía, viene de la tierra. Le gustaba apoltronarse y armar un porro con sus amigos por la noche. Siempre quería ir más y más allá. Hemos llegado aquí, decía, llevándose la mano a la mitad del pecho, pero tenemos que llegar aquí, continuaba, y levantaba la mano hasta el cuello.
Mallarmé was left in fragments and could not write it after his adored Anatole, his exquisite second-born, his future prospects, a celestial soul, succumbed to rheumatic fever, treacherous blow of death, ridiculous enemy, ailing in springtime, mourned in winter. His 8-year-old was lodged in a little cemetery overlooking the Seine, where skaters glided by at Christmas, and barges froze in the canals, and the moon eclipsed his future projects. Hugo could speak of his daughter's death. Hugo was happy to be able to speak of his daughter's death, but it was impossible for Mallarmé, though year after year he labored at a tomb for Anatole, which he could never complete, and immortality made human, an offering to the absolute. With his son transposed by death, Mallarmé was left with fragments.
Mallarmé se quedó en fragmentos y no pudo repararlo después de que su adorado Anatole, su exquisito hijo segundo, su perspectiva de futuro, un alma celestial, sucumbiera a la fiebre reumática, golpe traidor de la muerte, enemigo ridículo, enfermo en primavera, llorado en invierno. Alojaron a su hijo de 8 años en un pequeño cementerio con vista al Sena, donde los patinadores se deslizaban en Navidad y las barcazas se congelaban en los canales. La luna eclipsaba su perspectiva de futuro. Hugo pudo hablar de la muerte de su hija. Hugo estaba contento de ser capaz de hablar de la muerte de su hija, pero a Mallarmé le resultaba imposible, a pesar de que año tras año trabajaba en una tumba para Anatole, que nunca pudo completar, una inmortalidad hecha humana, una ofrenda a lo absoluto. Con su hijo traspuesto por la muerte, Mallarmé se quedó con los fragmentos.
I did not know the work of mourning is like carrying a bag of cement up a mountain at night. The mountaintop is not in sight because there is no mountaintop. Poor Sisyphus grief. I did not know I would struggle through a ragged underbrush without an upward path because there is no path. There's only a blunt rock with a river to fall into, and time with its medieval chambers, time with its jagged edges and blunt instruments. I did not know the work of mourning is a labor in the dark we carry inside ourselves, though sometimes when I sleep, I'm with him again, and then I wake. Poor Sisyphus grief. I am not ready for your heaviness cemented to my body. Look closely and you will see almost everyone carrying bags of cement on their shoulders. That's why it takes courage to get out of bed in the morning and climb into the day.
Yo no sabía que el trabajo del duelo es como cargar un saco de cemento cuesta arriba en la noche. No se puede ver la cumbre porque no hay ninguna cumbre. Pobre aflicción de Sísifo. Yo no sabía que iba a luchar entre andrajosos matorrales sin camino hacia arriba, porque no hay camino, solo hay una tosca roca con un río en donde caer. Y el tiempo, con sus aposentos medievales, el tiempo, con sus filos sinuosos y romos instrumentos. Yo no sabía que el trabajo del duelo es una labor en la oscuridad que llevamos por dentro, aunque a veces cuando duermo estoy de nuevo con él y luego despierto. Pobre pena de Sísifo. No estoy preparado para esta pesadumbre cimentada en mi cuerpo. Observa detenidamente y verás a casi todos acarreando sacos de cemento en los hombros. Es por eso que se requiere de valor para levantarse de la cama por la mañana y escalar el día.